What happens when a young man of only 24 inherits the vastest power in the known world? What unfolds when the authority of an empire that ruled from Britannia to Syria is concentrated in a single will, unchecked, unbalanced? That young man was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history would remember him by another name, Caligula. His figure has become synonymous with excess, cruelty, and extravagance. For centuries, chronicles painted him as a depraved monster, a tyrant who mistook the imperial throne for a stage for his madness. Yet, when we scrutinize the ancient sources and confront them with modern archaeology, an uncomfortable question arises: was he truly the monster they describe, or a victim of a political machinery that needed to demonize him to justify his downfall? Imagine the cobbled streets of Rome in the year 37 CE, wine cellars in taverns, priests carrying offerings to the temple of Jupiter, rumors running like invisible currents among marble columns and wooden balconies. The people celebrate the death of Tiberius, the elderly ruler who had governed for 2 decades from his retreat in Capri, while all await a golden age under the new emperor. Among the crowd, the name Caligula resonates with hope. No one yet imagines that, within just a few years, that same name would be whispered in fear. What begins here is not only the chronicle of a reign but also the portrait of a social experiment pushed to the limit. How far can power go when institutions no longer restrain it? How can an entire society become complicit, whether through fear or silence, in the abuses of a single man? This is the dilemma of Caligula. A story woven between reality and propaganda, between hostile testimonies and material remains. A story that, 2 millennia later, continues to question us about our own relationship with power. Rome, spring of the year 37 CE. The city breathes an air of expectation. The death of Tiberius in his villa at Capri brings to an end more than 20 years of a government marked by repression and fear. His long seclusion, guarded by armies of informants and accusers, had cast a shadow of suspicion over every corner of the empire. Now, with his disappearance, Rome seems to shake off the weight of a stone slab that had kept public life in suffocating silence. The Roman Forum, heart of political life, bustles like a reborn square. Merchants once again cry out their goods with the vigor of those who feel the gods have opened a new cycle. The columns of temples, blackened by the smoke of sacrifices, seem to shine with a renewed glow. The people crowd around the heralds announcing that the grandson of Germanicus, a military hero adored by soldiers and revered by the masses, has ascended to the imperial throne. Rome is a city of stark contrasts. In the overcrowded insulae, entire families share a single room, fearing the fire that could at any moment devour the 5-story buildings built of fragile wood. Just a few steps away, in aristocratic domus, gardens bloom with roses from Damascus, marble fountains flow, and mosaics narrate Greek myths. The capital of the empire is a mosaic of ostentatious wealth and resigned poverty, of architectural grandeur and urban chaos. On the Capitoline Hill, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus receives extraordinary sacrifices, white bulls decorated with golden ribbons, accompanied by solemn chants proclaiming the beginning of a promising reign. South of the Forum, the temple of Vesta keeps its eternal flame alight, guarded by the Vestal Virgins, symbols of purity and guarantors of Rome's destiny. Religion permeates every aspect of public life. What happens on the Palatine reverberates at the altars, and what occurs in the temples can determine the fate of an emperor. Across the 7 hills, the city becomes a political thermometer. The applause for young Caligula is sincere but also strategic. The people celebrate him as the son of the beloved Germanicus, the Senate welcomes him as a hope for reconciliation, and the soldiers acclaim him because his lineage descends from one of their most cherished generals. During those days of March, Rome seems convinced that a new era has begun. No one yet suspects that within this optimistic spring lie the seeds of a storm that, in barely 4 years, will turn the city into a stage of terror. At the heart of the Roman Forum, just steps from the Senate and the Arch of Augustus, stood one of the most sacred buildings of the city, the Temple of Vesta. Its circular design, unlike any other Roman temple, evoked the eternity and continuity of the city. There burned, never extinguished, the sacred fire that represented the very soul of Rome. Keeping it alive was the duty of 6 women whose lives did not belong to themselves but to the destiny of the empire, the Vestal Virgins. The vow taken by the Vestals was not merely religious but also political. Their purity symbolized the inviolability of Rome. Any fault committed by them was interpreted as an omen of ruin for the entire city. Their chastity was not a personal choice but a collective duty. Breaking it was punished with the most dreaded penalty, to be buried alive in an underground chamber while the crowd watched in silence. Yet at the same time, the Vestals enjoyed unique privileges in a society where women were relegated to the domestic sphere. They could own property, draft wills, free slaves, and their testimony in court carried the weight of 2 men. They walked the streets escorted by lictors, and even consuls bowed before them. They were, in essence, women above common law, consecrated and feared in equal measure. In the time of Caligula, the Virgo Vestalis Maxima was Cornelia Maxima, a woman who had dedicated more than 30 years to the goddess. Her discipline was legendary, her authority unquestioned. Beside her served young women from influential families: Claudia Pulchra, barely a teenager of imperial lineage, Livia Octavia, a descendant of Augustus, and other daughters of the aristocracy, carefully chosen after omens and rituals. They were not mere guardians of the flame, they were the keepers of Rome's religious and political legitimacy. The relationship between the Palatine, where the emperors resided, and the Temple of Vesta had always been delicate. While the Caesars claimed earthly power, the Vestals guarded the favor of the gods. The balance was fragile. No emperor could afford to make enemies of them without challenging the very essence of Roman tradition. That balance, however, would be tested under the reign of Caligula. In his figure, the religious purity of the Vestals would clash with the arbitrariness of absolute power. And in that tension lay one of the most disturbing keys to his rule: how far could an emperor go before breaking even the most sacred taboos? To understand the young man who, in 37 AD, ascended to the imperial throne, it is necessary to go back to his early years, to a childhood marked by glory, tragedy, and constant fear. Caligula was born into one of the most admired and, at the same time, most threatened families of Rome. His father, Germanicus, was the most charismatic general of his time, victorious in Germania, beloved by the soldiers, adored by the people. His mere presence on the battlefield raised the morale of the legions. Yet that same popularity stirred the jealousy of Tiberius, the reigning emperor, who saw in his nephew a threat to his authority. In the year 19, when Gaius was only 7 years old, Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances. Chroniclers describe convulsions, dark vomit, and charms of black magic found in his bed. Many believed he had been poisoned by order of Tiberius. The news unleashed a wave of public grief. Citizens wept in the streets, soldiers built improvised altars, and his name became synonymous with lost hope. For young Gaius, however, it marked the beginning of a life surrounded by death. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of the divine Augustus, was a woman of unbreakable character. She publicly denounced Tiberius, accused him of eliminating her husband, and became a troubling figure at court. The emperor's response was brutal. He exiled her to the island of Pandateria, where she would die of starvation after years of confinement. To young Caligula's eyes, Rome was not the heart of civilization, but an arena of betrayals. His adolescence was spent on the island of Capri, alongside Tiberius. There, in the villa of the aging emperor, he witnessed an atmosphere of paranoia and decadence. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Capri was a stage where executions became spectacle and palace intrigues a daily routine. Gaius learned to survive in that environment by repeating a single lesson: never show weakness. He earned the nickname Little Boot, Caligula, from the miniature military sandals he wore in his father's camps, a name that would follow him forever. Tiberius himself, aware of the boy's character, once described him as a serpent being raised for the Roman people. He was not mistaken. In Capri, Caligula absorbed the idea that politics was a theater of masks, where a smile could conceal a dagger and where apparent obedience was the only path to survival. Thus was forged the young man who, at only 24 years old, would inherit not only the throne, but also the neuroses of a dynasty marked by suspicion, violence, and fear. When Caligula was proclaimed emperor in March of 37 AD, Rome erupted in jubilation. The plebeians, weary of Tiberius' repression, saw in the son of Germanicus the rightful heir of military glory and the hope of a new Augustus. The soldiers hailed him as the descendant of their most beloved general, and the Senate, at least in appearance, welcomed him as a restorer of concord between prince and aristocracy. During the first months, Caligula fulfilled those expectations abundantly. He cancelled trials initiated under Tiberius, freed prisoners unjustly accused, banned certain abuses of informers, and restored honors to persecuted families. His generosity was so lavish it seemed to overflow the empire's coffers. He distributed donations to the plebeians, offered public banquets, and organized games that stretched on for days. The people celebrated him as the son of Rome. The city, long accustomed to the tense silence of previous years, filled with cheers, songs, and processions. Caligula walked the streets accompanied by multitudes who greeted him with flowers and chants. His popularity was such that, according to Philo of Alexandria, even in the provinces altars were lit in his honor. The spectacles reached an unprecedented splendor: gladiators, chariot races, hunts of wild beasts brought from Africa. The young emperor invested colossal sums in festivities that seemed like a rebirth of Augustan Rome. The elite, though distrustful of his excessive generosity, could not oppose him without risking being seen as enemies of the people. For a moment, Rome believed it had found in Caligula a sovereign capable of uniting the masses and the aristocracy, of restoring the greatness lost under the grey rule of Tiberius. They were months of collective enthusiasm, of almost feverish optimism. But that illusion would not last. In October of that same year, a mysterious fever laid him low for weeks, and when he awoke, the man Rome had adored was no longer the same. The chroniclers agree, what followed the illness marked a point of no return in his reign. In October of the year 37 AD, barely 8 months after his accession, Caligula fell gravely ill. The nature of the illness remains a mystery. Suetonius speaks of a burning fever, Dio Cassius mentions delirium and loss of reason, some modern scholars suspect encephalitis, epilepsy, or even poisoning. For weeks, all of Rome held its breath. The young emperor, only 24 years old, hovered between life and death. The Senate, fearing for the stability of the state, began to consider possible successors. The people, however, crowded the temples, offering desperate sacrifices to Jupiter, Asclepius, and even foreign gods to save him. Accounts say that on his sickbed, Caligula murmured the names of Eastern divinities, strange deities to the Romans, as if seeking in them powers beyond the traditional gods. The doctors applied every remedy: purges, bloodletting, infusions of exotic herbs, magical amulets, solemn prayers. Nothing seemed to work. Finally, against all odds, Caligula rose from his bed. But those who knew him claimed that something had changed forever. He was no longer the generous young man who offered games and distributed donations. He was a man marked by the experience of near death. Some chroniclers maintain that he believed himself reborn, not as a human emperor, but as a divine being. From there arose his obsession with being called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. What had once been popular jubilation began to transform into a reign governed by fear, extravagance, and boundless will. The fever of that autumn not only altered his health, it changed the destiny of the Roman Empire. After his recovery in the autumn of 37 AD, the new Caligula seemed like a distorted shadow of the young man Rome had once loved. If before he had been celebrated as a savior, now he began to reveal himself as an unpredictable despot. The first sign was his change of character. Dio Cassius notes that he no longer tolerated jokes or criticism, and saw treason at every turn. He ordered the execution of those who, during his illness, had discussed possible successors. What Rome had considered political prudence, he interpreted as conspiracy. Gratitude toward the Senate and his allies vanished, replaced by burning resentment. Suetonius affirms that, convinced of his own divinity, he ordered that he be worshipped as a living god. He demanded to be called Dominus et Deus, titles that not even Augustus had dared to accept. He had statues of himself erected in temples and portrayed himself with the attributes of Jupiter, Apollo, or even Venus, blurring the lines between male and female, the sacred and the profane. Wastefulness was another symptom of his transformation. If in his first months he had spent to win the people's affection, he now squandered resources on absurd projects. The most famous, a floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, built with ships lined up so that he could ride over it dressed in the armor of Alexander the Great. The cost was so colossal that it depleted reserves meant to feed entire provinces. At the same time, rumors about his private life began to multiply. It was said that he had incestuous relations with his sisters, that he forced senators to prostitute their wives at banquets, that the imperial court had become a stage for unimaginable excesses. Although modern historians warn that many of these accusations may have been exaggerated, the truth is that in Rome no one saw in Caligula the golden youth anymore, but rather a capricious tyrant. The city, which months earlier had revered him like a new son, was beginning to fear him. The turning point had been reached, the reign of hope was transforming into the reign of fear. Power in Rome was not sustained by legions and taxes alone. It was anchored in the sacred, in the conviction that the gods protected the empire as long as their rituals were observed. And among all religious institutions, none was more venerated or feared than the College of the Vestal Virgins. The 6 priestesses of the Temple of Vesta were the guardians of the eternal flame, which represented the soul of Rome. Their virginity symbolized the purity of the city, and their vow was so sacred that breaking it meant being buried alive. Their word carried legal weight, their presence inspired reverence, and even the consuls bowed before them. In the year 38, barely a year after recovering from his illness, Caligula set his sights on this inviolable core of tradition. According to Dio Cassius and fragments attributed to Philo, he began inviting the Vestals to banquets on the Palatine, disguised as religious celebrations. There, under burning torches and surrounded by trembling senators, the young emperor staged mythological representations in which the priestesses were forced to play roles that bordered on blasphemy. A particularly disturbing testimony comes from a letter attributed to Seneca the Younger, its authenticity still debated, but considered plausible by some modern scholars, which recounts how Claudia Pulchra, barely a teenager, was forced to portray Leda in the myth of the swan, under the pleased gaze of the emperor dressed as Jupiter. Did it really happen? Historians caution that later sources hostile to Caligula's memory may have exaggerated or even invented such scenes to justify his assassination. But the truth is that, in Rome's collective memory, the scandal remained, the emperor had desecrated what was most sacred. The climax of the conflict came when Caligula ordered that his statue be placed in the Temple of Vesta, next to the eternal flame. It was the first time the Vestals openly refused to obey an emperor. Cornelia Maxima, the chief Vestal, appeared on the Palatine wearing her ceremonial robe and spoke with a firmness that astonished even her enemies: "Purity does not obey men, but gods." The defiance was so unprecedented that, although furious, Caligula did not dare execute the Vestals publicly. But the message was clear: his absolute will had met a limit, and that limit came from the divine. From then on, the rumor that the emperor had endangered the gods' protection over Rome began to spread like an invisible poison through the streets and forums. After the clash with the Vestals, Caligula intensified his strategy of absolute domination. Anyone who thought he would stop at religious boundaries would soon discover that the emperor recognized no limits, divine or human. The Senate became his first target. That institution, which had governed Rome for centuries, was turned into a stage of humiliation. Caligula called sessions just to mock the senators, forcing them to run beside him in the circus as charioteers or to kiss his feet in front of the populace. Some were forced to applaud in degrading spectacles where their wives or daughters were auctioned to the highest bidder, with the emperor as master of ceremonies. He was no less cruel to his own allies. Cassius Chaerea, tribune of the Praetorian Guard, bitterly remembered how the emperor ridiculed him by giving military passwords with female names like Venus or Amor. What might have seemed a heavy joke to others was an intolerable affront to a war veteran. The people also experienced the dark side of the young ruler. After squandering public funds on banquets and absurd projects, Caligula began imposing suffocating taxes. He taxed everything from marriages to trials, from public baths to brothels, with such voracity that even the humblest sectors, once beneficiaries of his initial generosity, began to see him as a predator. And in this climate, executions became a routine spectacle. Accounts from Suetonius and Dio Cassius mention how he delighted in watching tortures during dinners, ordering prisoners to be executed between courses to entertain his guests. The Palatine had turned into a theater of fear. Senators, generals, plebeians, and even members of his own family lived under the shadow of suspicion. No one was safe from a sudden accusation, a misinterpreted gesture, or an imperial whim. Rome, which had initially revered him as the son of the empire, now saw him as an unpredictable volcano, dazzling in its brilliance, yet capable of destroying everything in any eruption. By the beginning of 41 CE, Imperial Rome was immersed in a stifling climate of fear. The Senate was humiliated, the Praetorian Guard divided, and the people exhausted by excessive taxes. Caligula, barely 28 years old, had become everyone's enemy and, paradoxically, the most protected man in the empire. In the halls of the Palatine and the baths of Agrippa, plans for his downfall began to take shape. The conspirators were an unusual mix: offended senators, guard officers, and even members of the nobility who had suffered public humiliation. But the most determined leader was Cassius Chaerea, the Praetorian tribune whom the emperor constantly mocked with effeminate passwords. For Chaerea, the conspiracy was not only political, it was personal, a settling of accounts for years of humiliation. The preparations were as discreet as they were desperate. They knew that if they failed, they and their entire families would be executed. The role of the Vestal Virgins was even debated. If they declared that Caligula's actions were divinely inspired, the conspiracy would lose legitimacy. Some accounts suggest they were secretly warned to remain silent, though this can never be confirmed. The appointed day was January 24, 41 CE, during the Palatine Games. After several days of exhausting spectacles, Caligula decided to retreat to his private chambers for lunch. To get there, he had to pass through a narrow corridor decorated with frescoes of his ancestors' military victories. That corridor, which he had traversed countless times, became his deadly trap. There, Chaerea awaited him with a drawn sword. "Abe, Caesar," he said firmly before plunging the blade into his neck. Caligula screamed and tried to resist, but soon other conspirators joined in the slaughter. There were more than 30 stabs, executed with the precision of those who knew the emperor must die without any chance of recovery. His last words, according to Suetonius, were, "Still alive, still alive." The body lay on the marble while rumors began spreading through the city immediately. Some celebrated it as poetic justice, others feared the wrath of the gods would fall on Rome for the imperial blood spilled. But the fate was already sealed. The first emperor assassinated by his own guard had fallen, and with him a wound opened that would forever transform the Roman throne. Caligula's assassination did not bring immediate calm, but a whirlwind of uncertainty. Once his body lay lifeless in that Palatine corridor, the conspirators realized that the most dangerous part was yet to come: who would occupy the throne now? The Senate, eager to regain power lost since Augustus, debated in secret the possibility of restoring the Republic. But that illusion lasted little. The Praetorian Guard, fearful of losing its privileges, found Claudius, the assassinated emperor's uncle, hiding in the palace. According to the chronicles, they found him trembling behind a curtain, convinced that he would also be executed. Instead of killing him, they hailed him as the new prince, ensuring the continuity of the imperial monarchy. Meanwhile, Caligula's corpse was treated with the utmost ignominy. His body, mutilated by the stabs, remained unburied until some women of his family secretly recovered it and gave it a discreet burial in the gardens of the Lamiani. There were no funeral honors, no solemn procession, no official remembrance. The Senate decreed a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation to oblivion. They ordered his statues destroyed, his name erased from inscriptions, and his removal from public records. Rome had to pretend that this emperor had never existed. But oblivion proved impossible. His figure, wrapped in rumors of madness and excess, survived more strongly than many of his successors. The propaganda meant to erase him instead turned him into a dark myth, an eternal warning about the dangers of absolute power. The damnatio memoriae, rather than extinguishing him, immortalized him. The people remembered his eccentricities in obscene songs, senators invoked him as an example of tyranny, and historians used him as a mirror of what a ruler should not be. Thus, the attempt to erase his memory ensured that his name, Caligula, would cross 20 centuries as a synonym for corruption, madness, and imperial excess. The story of Caligula, shrouded in exaggeration and propaganda, remains one of the most disturbing in Imperial Rome. He was loved as a savior, feared as a tyrant, and ultimately assassinated as a monster. But between the extremes of adoration and hatred lies a more uncomfortable truth: his reign was also a reflection of a society that allowed and tolerated his excesses. Ancient chroniclers, from Suetonius to Cassius Dio, constructed the image of an emperor who embodied the worst of human nature: boundless lust, gratuitous cruelty, disdain for institutions, and a thirst to be worshipped as a god. Yet every line written against him also served political interests. It was necessary to justify his assassination and legitimize those who took power after his fall. So, was Caligula an absolute monster or a traumatized young man who inherited a dynasty sick with intrigue, poison, and paranoia? Perhaps both. The tragedy of his life and reign was that he did not know, or did not want, to recognize limits. And when a man without brakes controls the most powerful empire in the world, the consequences become inevitable. His death did not solve Rome's problems; on the contrary, it opened the door to new conspiracies, a weakened Senate, and a Praetorian Guard that understood its own power to make and unmake emperors. The echo of that lesson lasted for centuries. The imperial throne belonged not only to the prince but to those who could hold it or topple it by the sword. 200 years later, when the empire was already faltering, Caligula's name was still cited as a warning of what happened when absolute power was mixed with arbitrariness and fear. And even today, 20 centuries later, his figure continues to fascinate and terrify, reminding us that the history of Rome is also a story of our own fragility in the face of the temptation of power. In the ashes of his memory remains a question that transcends time: how responsible are we for the tyrants we tolerate?